Canada falling apart? That's the question a lot of people are asking themselves these days looking at the latest news. If Quebec fighting for independence is not new, Alberta's separatist talks came out of nowhere, or at least so it seems. Welcome to my channel where I keep immigrants in Canada updated about the most important news and events and what they mean for us. And in today's video, we are going to discuss what exactly is going on with Quebec and Alberta, why do they want to separate from Canada, and what's going to happen next. Stick till the end of this video to find out my opinion on whether Canada is actually going to crack down. As you know, Canada is a huge country with 10 provinces and 3 territories. All of them have different cultures, policies, politics, systems, and even languages. So it may seem like they live in harmony, but these differences can sometimes cause tension. And right now, this tension is getting louder. So let's try to understand together what exactly is happening. So I'll start with Quebec because Quebec was the first province to start a separatist movement, and what you need to understand about Quebec is that it is culturally very different from the rest of Canada. And Quebecers actually think that it is not just a province but a nation within a nation. First of all, it is the only province in Canada where French is the official language, and there's so much to say about this topic, but what you need to keep in mind is that French is one of the identifying features of the Quebec nation, and it plays a huge role in everyday life. It is the default language in everything, and it is enforced way more strictly than a lot of people may think. Signs, government forms, customer service, public transport announcements, everything has to be in French. Wherever you go, schools, hospitals, public organizations, all services will be provided in French. Actually, with some exceptions, you're not even allowed to be served in English. Although you will still hear English in some places in Quebec, specifically in Montreal, because this is a bilingual city. But if you go outside of Montreal, someplace else in Quebec, you probably will not hear any English whatsoever. The province also enforces French through education. For example, children of immigrants have to go to a French school. So if you live in Quebec and you're planning to have kids, keep that in mind. Quebec also requires businesses to operate in French. For example, when they post a job opportunity, they have to indicate that the candidate must be fluent in French. All of the national and international companies that operate in Quebec also have to adapt to comply with the law. For example, they adapt their branding, packaging, or even their websites. Some of them even have to change their names. For example, what's known as Staples in the rest of Canada is Bureau en Gros in Quebec, or the pharmacy shoppers in Quebec became Pharmaprix. One of the most bizarre examples is KFC. In Quebec, it is called PFK, and a lot of people who come to Quebec cannot understand what it means. What they did, they took the full name of the company and literally translated it to French, so it became Poulet Frit de Kentucky, hence PFK. The problem is that despite all of these efforts, preserving French is not that simple, and the Francophone population is declining steadily with more and more people using English in their everyday life. To give you an idea, the proportion of the population that primarily speaks French at home dropped from 82.3% in 1991 to 77.5% in 2021. You may say that these numbers don't look like much, but this is a trend that is accelerating. Quebec is a small province surrounded by English from all sides, and Anglophone culture, unfortunately, is pushing very strong. And not only that, Quebec is so interconnected with the rest of Canada and with the United States that some people just have no choice but to speak English in their day-to-day life. For example, many national companies have teams with people from different provinces working together. I mean, I'm mostly Anglophone, so that really doesn't bother me, but a lot of people in Montreal have to adapt because their teammates definitely don't speak French. I'm really not sure how they're going to control companies like that to operate 100% in French in Quebec. So overall, Quebecers have a very strong sense of national identity. They view themselves as a separate society with its own culture and history. And a lot of them feel like the federal government is not treating them properly, that they're lacking representation on the federal level, and that they're not providing enough protection of their culture and language. So independence is just one option that will allow them to control their own affairs and resources. Believe it or not, but the separatist movement dates back to the 18th century, before Canada even became a country. Quebec never really wanted to be a part of the British Empire and then of the Canadian Confederation later on. The Confederation did offer some benefits though, for example, transcontinental railway, defense, or economic development, but they have always felt threatened to lose their identity. So Quebec continued to hold grudges but stayed a part of Canada until things got really serious in the 60s and 70s. That's the time when Quebec shifted from a deeply religious and traditional society to a more modern one. They started to separate the power of the Catholic Church from the provincial government, particularly in areas like education and healthcare, and that encouraged a lot of Quebecers to start taking part in the economy, which previously had been controlled mostly by English-speaking elites. So Quebec developed its own unique arts and culture with its own artists, musicians, and writers playing a significant role. And as a result of all of these changes, a separatist movement was born, something that is often called the Quiet Revolution. So in 1980, Quebec had its first referendum on independence, and at that time, almost 60% of Quebecers voted to stay in Canada, but the conversation did not end there. In 1995, it happened again, but this time the result was razor thin. 49.4% of Quebecers voted to leave Canada. That's right, almost half of the province wanted out. But it is what it is, the majority still voted for staying in Canada, even if the difference was only 1%. So since then, things kind of come down a little bit, but the general sentiment didn't go anywhere. And you see it in politics, in debates over immigration and language laws, and just generally in the way that Quebec negotiates with Ottawa. They want more control over who comes in, how they integrate, and what culture means in Quebec. They do have some influence on the federal level, though, through Bloc Québécois. This is basically a federal party that defends Quebec nationalism and promotes independence. And this time they got 23 seats in the parliament, which is not nothing. So no, Quebec is not separating from Canada, at least not anytime soon. First of all, the separatist movement did go down, and younger people are generally more interested in economic issues than independence. Not to mention that would be very hard to implement and will cause all sorts of economic, legal, and logistical complications. Now, Alberta is a totally different beast. Their issue is not about identity, but about money, control, and federal policies. The reason why Alberta is so attractive and valuable for Canada is its resources. It has a lot of oil and gas. If you didn't know, Alberta actually has the 4th largest oil reserve in the world, and its economy relies heavily on exporting oil to other provinces and internationally. The problem is that the federal government has been interfering a lot with the development of the infrastructure to support export, for example, by blocking the construction of pipelines or canceling various oil and gas projects. Why is the government causing so much trouble? Well, here's one of the reasons. As you know, the Liberal Party has been in power for 10 years already, and they put a very big emphasis on environmental protection, and they invest heavily in the green sector. And you can imagine that supporting fossil fuels is not necessarily on their agenda, since pipelines can threaten ecosystems and water sources due to potential oil spills or through their contribution to climate change. And on top of that, other provinces like Quebec or British Columbia didn't want the pipelines to go through their territories, and unfortunately, the federal government failed to protect Alberta's interests. One good example is Energy East pipeline that was supposed to ship crude oil from Alberta to Eastern Canada for export. The project was first announced in 2013, but it never really passed the regulatory and the planning phase, and it was cancelled in 2017. What happened is that under pressure from the federal government and environmental groups, the National Energy Board, this is the body that regulates Canada's energy sector, changed the rules in the middle of the review process. They forced the building company to evaluate the additional impact of upstream greenhouse gas emissions from oil extraction in Alberta and downstream emissions from refining and burning the oil in Canada and overseas. And traditionally, pipeline reviews would only consider the impact of the pipeline itself, not what happens before or after the oil goes through. And this obviously caused a lot of delays and uncertainty, and the cost went up as well. So the company that was building this pipeline decided to abandon the project altogether. There was also another factor at that time. The global oil price was dropping, so the project overall didn't seem as attractive anymore. Ironically, since Energy East was terminated, global oil demand grew from 98 million barrels per day in 2017 to 104 in 2024. Something else that got people in Alberta really angry was that the government did nothing when Quebec protested against this pipeline. And that kind of created an impression that Ottawa favors Quebec's interest over national infrastructure. As a result, this is costing the Canadian economy billions of dollars annually, not to mention the loss of jobs in constructing and operating those pipelines. And adding to the energy conflicts, Albertans also think that Ottawa is using their resources without giving them much in return. Alberta pays a lot of taxes to the federal government, and of course a lot of people feel like they're not getting enough back, especially if compared to other provinces. You'll see what I mean when we go over the system of equalization payments. So the point of equalization payments is that they're supposed to help provinces to provide public services with reasonable technology taxation, regardless of how much revenue they generate. Basically, it's supposed to promote fairness and equality so that all Canadians, regardless of where they live, would have access to quality public services such as healthcare, education, or infrastructure. So the way it works is that federal government calculates each province's capacity to make money through taxes, and then they determine the national average of fiscal capacity. So provinces below the national average would then receive top-ups to bring them up to the national average, and obviously the provinces that are above the national average are getting nothing. And of course, Alberta is one of them, so they feel like it is deeply unfair that they receive nothing, and honestly, I cannot disagree with them. If you look at the equalization payments planned for 2025-2026, you will see that Alberta has by far the highest fiscal capacity, both from natural and other resources, and is receiving zero in return. So separatist talks in Alberta are not new, they come up now and then, but Alberta never really got close to separating. So why is this in the news again? Well, my guess is that it has to do with the federal election that just took place. Keep in mind that a big chunk of those troubles that we discussed was caused by the Liberal government, which has been in power for 10 years. And as we all know, the Liberal government won again, and if you look at the results of the election, you will see that Alberta is deeply blue. It means that people mostly vote for the Conservative Party there. So considering everything that Alberta has gone through historically, they of course are not expecting anything good from the new government either. So in light of this, Premier Danielle Smith, Alberta's leader, recently said that she's open to having a referendum on whether Alberta should separate from Canada. But for them to actually have a referendum, first they need to obtain a petition from at least 10% of eligible voters. Although this is not an outright declaration of separation, this sort of gives a signal to the Albertans that they have a right to decide their future themselves. And of course, Trump, in his usual fashion, did not miss that opportunity to make a comment about welcoming Alberta as the 51st state of America. And you know what? I'm sure that a lot of people would not mind that. Is there a chance that Alberta will actually separate from Canada? Well, from a legal perspective, that would be a little bit complex. According to the Clarity Act, any province that wants to leave must get a clear majority in a referendum and then negotiate the terms of separation with the federal government. And unfortunately, public support for separation in Alberta is far from majority. According to the recent polls, only 36% of Alberta said that they would want to leave Canada. And I will admit that this is actually a significant and a concerning number, so the conversation is definitely gaining traction, but it is still not enough for a breakup. So what is the federal government saying about all this? Obviously, they're avoiding the direct confrontation, and they're also using a mix of vague statements about unity, kind of acknowledging the issues, and also referring to the constitutional realities. Some of their arguments are that Canada is stronger together, that they're committed to solving these issues, and that they're actually going to support some of the national projects. They say that they're open to rebuild bridges, but let's be honest, some of their main values, specifically regarding climate legislation or emission caps, go against Alberta's interests. So I'm not sure how that is going to play out. Leaving Canada would hurt trade, currency stability, and federal support, and there are things that Ottawa can do politically and economically to prevent this separation. For example, they can reform Equalization, or at least make the formula more transparent and responsive to the economic change. They can allow more provincial autonomy in issues like natural resources, immigration, or taxation. Perhaps invest in diversifying their economy in fields like agriculture or energy innovation. And when it comes to canceled projects like we just discussed, the least thing that they could do is at least provide some support to prevent this feeling of abandonment. So let's sum it all up. Is Canada really falling apart? I know that this is a very emotional question, but my honest answer is no. At least not yet, but is definitely facing some very serious issues. Out of control housing prices, especially in cities like Toronto and Vancouver. Healthcare system that is stretched so thin that a lot of people are losing faith in the universal healthcare altogether. With increasing cost of living, Canadians are feeling economically squeezed, and a lot of people are just living paycheck to paycheck. And finally, immigration rates are making a lot of Canadians furious, considering that the infrastructure cannot keep up. And all of this is obviously making provinces lose trust in the federal government and ask for more autonomy. As of now, we mostly hear Alberta and Quebec speaking up, but it's just a matter of time until other provinces start expressing their opinion too. So whoever's in power has to act boldly and do it soon. Otherwise, the cracks that we're seeing today can really tear the country apart tomorrow. And now it's your turn to let me know in the comments what you think about this topic. Is Canada going to stay united, or is there a chance that we're heading toward a split? And don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more updates that actually matter for Canadians and immigrants.